one of the struggles I have found, and I think other people may have found this too, is getting my 80-year-old parents to adhere to certain diet changes. And one of the things, my dad, just so with full transparency, he's the one we're the most concerned about right now, is that he forgets. So when I'm like, hey, Dad, you're not eating a big bowl of cereal first thing when you get up in the morning, he's like, okay. He remembers when I tell him, and then the next morning he goes and eats a bowl of cereal. So I have been trying to figure out, outside of just going in and making sure there's no cereal in his house, like I've even wondered about something like exogenous ketones. Could I put some exogenous ketones into him to be able to spark that brain activity? And how do I get an aging parent to change their food habits? Because that has been tough.
It's such a great question. I was with my mom recently, and she always gives me a hard time. She's like, "You're trying to give me an eating disorder when you try to get me into ketosis." Yeah. And so I got my CGM on, and I asked her to put her one on her and supported her in that process, just so she could learn, so she could get more information about what's going on and start connecting what she's eating to how she's feeling. Yeah. And sometimes that's just an invitation, right? We can't change other people's behavior, but sometimes we can influence it. And I think that modeling is one of the most important things. So us taking this on, showing what's possible, sharing how we feel. Sometimes my mom's cousins are really into it. And so they've started doing it. And all of a sudden she's like, oh, maybe I should listen to Heather, right? Like it changes her perspective, right? Yeah. Who's influencing your dad, right? Is there a good friend of his? Is there someone in his bridge club or somebody that he plays tennis with who might have a bigger impact than us as the daughter, right? Like, what do you know? Yeah. I'm the parent in this relationship. And so that can be one strategy. You mentioned environment. Like, should I just take the cereal out of his house? Yeah, I think you should, right? We call this cleanse your kitchen. You go in and you take everything out, because people struggling with dementia, if there's a banana on the counter, they're going to go, oh, this is healthy for me. And especially people in their 70s, 80s, right? They remember that food pyramid from the 80s and 90s that killed people, literally has caused chronic disease in this country, right? It's criminal that we were told to eat 8 servings of grains a day. And that was the foundation of our diet, with sugar, processed grains. I mean, and that fats were vilified. Really, that should be turned on its head, and we should be having a lot of fats. But fruits are one of those really confusing ones for people. Are you telling me fruit is bad for me? No. But it won't help you get into ketosis if that's the goal. No. Right? So we need to be strategic about what we allow into the kitchen. And so that somebody who is struggling with dementia, or to even wrap their head around the concept, doesn't have a lot of the junk or even anything that's going to raise blood sugar easily accessible. Now, this is part of why I created Marama, which is a residential care facility for the elderly, where we have an immersive experience in this approach. It includes an organic ketogenic diet, all of the brain healing exercises, the socialization, a non-toxic environment, and caregivers who are trained to expect people to get better, and also know how to manage the supplements and the hormones and all of the things, the medications that someone on a Bredesen type approach would be doing. And so it's because of this question from people like you, right? I want my dad to get the benefit of Dr. Bredesen's approach, my mentor's approach, but do I move in with him? Do I quit my job? Like, what about my kids? What about my relationship? How do I navigate this and get him the benefit when I can't drop everything and do it for him? And this is challenging, and the dynamics are different, right? Often we'll talk to people and, hey, my sister doesn't believe that there's any science behind this. Now, you can send her the Ornish paper that came out in June, which showed that lifestyle randomized controlled trial, the first of its kind, that showed that these interventions can be helpful. They used a vegan diet. So, I'm a fan of keto with animal products. I think that makes it so that our diet is not too restrictive, but you have options, right? There's science suggesting that changing from a standard American diet to a vegan diet or a ketogenic diet can be very, very helpful for cognition. And so, there's science out there, but if your sister is totally anti, come back to you, be the model, do it for you, and prevent cognitive decline, especially if you're genetically related to whoever you're concerned about. Make sure that you are being the model and you are putting this information to work for your brain. We're not going to be able to convince everyone. but we can give them information and we can set things up. There's meal delivery programs through Apollo Health. Nutrition for Longevity does ketogenic meal delivery, which makes it a lot easier. So there's resources and there's support.
Yeah, it's funny because on that topic, my brain has been saying over and over again, like, don't lose your life in trying to save theirs. And it's a little bit like I can feel them declining very quickly. And my sister and I are like tag teaming every day, talking about, okay, I talked to them today. They're doing this. We've had to take over their finances because my dad was paying things like 5-6 times. And it's interesting what you said about there's this line between you want to help them, but you also want to save yourself and not lose your life in that process. So and I tried the glucose monitor on my dad, and he couldn't figure out how to use it. It was like so complicated. I'm like, okay, I'd have to like be with him day in and day out and scan it on him for him to see it. So would you say that if you had an aging parent, a really good is going through this, a really good number just to keep your eye on is hemoglobin A1C?
Absolutely, without a doubt. And we use the MoCA score, the Montreal Cognitive Assessment, as a way to put a number on where someone's cognition is. And we have much more confidence, right? The earlier on in the disease process, the easier it is to turn things around. So if you're starting to notice that mom or dad is forgetful, start then. Get a MoCA score and then do what Dr. Bredesen calls a cognoscopy, right? Just like we get a colonoscopy to see if we have risk for colon cancer, get all of the lab testing done. Look at toxins, look at nutrients, look at gut, look at all of the things a functional medicine doctor would look at and see if there are risk factors that you have control over. And then do what you can to address them. And of course, the lifestyle medicine is the most important. That is the foundation, right? The functional medicine testing and all that is the icing on the foundational cake of diet, exercise, sleep, and stress management. So get those things dialed as much as you can. And then in these conversations, I mentioned I was with family recently, and I have an aunt who's the matriarch of my family. I mean, I just adore her. She's been one of the most impactful people, taught me so much throughout my whole life. And she's been suffering with dementia for 5 or 6 years. And her husband is a conventional MD, and they had very little interest in what I was doing. And just recently, my mom texted me this morning. She's like, oh, they're asking questions and they're engaging about what's in your book. And I was like, what? Like, I brought tears to my eyes. Like, what? Like, I might be able to help this woman I love so much after feeling I'm like getting emotional. After feeling for years, like I couldn't, right? Because I wasn't speaking her language. And so sometimes it just takes a little bit of patience and putting it out there and not pushing too hard. I think when we push too hard, people become resistant. Yes. It's human nature, right? Especially if we're trying to control someone else's behavior. But if we can just keep modeling, giving them information, maybe putting resources in front of them, like meal delivery, that make it easy, then I think that is potentially a way to get some change. And then there's so many directions we could go with this.
Right, exactly.
Well, the ketones.
Well, before you answer that, I want to address the doctor issue, because every time my dad goes and gets blood work, I say, give it to me, let me take a look at it. And what I'm finding is not happening in the doctor's office with him is this acknowledgement of how important hemoglobin A1C is. I feel like if we just used one target, let's just like create one target for everybody. And so he's like, my doctor says I'm fine. And I'm like, yeah, but Dad,
he's at what, like 6.2 or something?
Yeah. I'm like, you're at a really, like, I want you at 5.0 and he's at about 5.7. So he's like, my doctor says I'm fine. I'm like, you're not fine. We have to get this one thing down. So is there a way, do you think that story about your aunt and, are the tides turning? Are doctors waking up and realizing that neurodegenerative decline is intimately tied to metabolically unfit humans?
Well, certainly the research is there, right? This is published, but it takes a long time to get in front of primary care providers and neurologists who are having these conversations with people day to day. And I think there's also this element of well, this person's retired. They've done the work. Let them indulge. Let them enjoy the retirement.
Yes.
And I think that does people a disservice. Not everyone wants to hear that. There are people who, when they're facing this last chapter of life or this last season of life, they want to live it fully. They want to be present at their grandchildren.
That's what my dad says.
Yeah. And so
he's like, I'm tired of being disciplined. He's like, he's kind of got a fuck it attitude. He's like, whatever.
Hey.
I don't know how much longer I have here.
I had a conversation with a 95-year-old gentleman recently, and the Aricept, a couple of the medications that are available for dementia, they don't work very well. And 5 years later, people are not doing as well as if they never started them, right? Donepezil or Aricept and the Namenda or memantine, these two medications, they get used together and separately. And if you start them, sometimes people get a little bump, but 5 years later, they're worse off cognitively than if they never started them. So I had this conversation with a 95-year-old man. He's like, I'm not going to be here in 5 years. Just put me on them, And so, I had to laugh and I had to respect that, right? It's his decision. Yeah. And so all we can do is give people information. And then it's not for everyone. It requires work. It requires some discipline and some figuring out the Dexcom or whatever continuous glucose monitor you use. Figuring out the ketone, all of these things.